Well, welcome everybody, and thank you for joining the Australian Alliance for Animals for the launch of our Fair Go for Animals campaign. My name is Bidder Jones, and I'm the Director of Strategy and Research at the Alliance, and I'll be your host for this launch webinar. Today, we're speaking to you from the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and recognise their enduring connections to land, sea and community, and pay my respects to their elders past and present. And I'd like to extend that respect to any First Nations people in our audience. I'd also like to acknowledge that we have a number of distinguished guests in our audience today, including members of Parliament. I'd like to thank you for your time and for your interest in this important topic. I should also note that we're recording this webinar and it will be made available online through the Alliance website and through YouTube and through the Animal Welfare Collaborative talk series. So for those of you who haven't met us yet, the Alliance for Animals is a new national charity formed with the aim of creating systemic change for animals. The Alliance core members are 6 of Australia's leading animal protection organisations, and we also count a further 18 groups as part of our broader organisational network. So I'm going to run through our program today, a quick run through our program so that you know what's ahead. We'll be starting our launch event today with a short introduction from the Chair of the Alliance for Animals Board, the Honourable Dr. Craig Emerson. Then we'll hear from our Head of Programs and Legal Counsel at the Alliance, Dr. Meg Good, about what the Fair Go for Animals campaign is all about. After we've heard from Meg, we'll move on to hear from our Director of Policy and Government Relations, Dr. Jed Goodfellow, and Jed will take us through the key elements of the Building a Fairer Australia for Animals report. We'll then have discussion about some of the key elements of the campaign and the report before we take your questions. So you can post questions at any time using the Q&A tab on your screen. You can choose to post questions with your name, or you can do that anonymously if you prefer. Just bear in mind, we might not have time to answer all the questions. So if you've got a burning one, please post it early and then it'll get up the list. So that's all I need to tell you at this stage. So without further ado, I'd like to hand over to our chair, Dr. Craig Emerson, to launch the campaign.
Good afternoon, everyone. It gives me great pleasure to open today's launch of the Alliance's Fair Go for Animals campaign. I've always believed that the way society treats its most vulnerable members is a measure of its progress. And the question for us to consider today is, how is Australia faring on that measure when it comes to the treatment of our animals? Animals bring so much joy to our lives. Most of you will have pets and you know how much fun and enjoyment they can give us, but also our iconic wildlife. And indeed, the many millions of animals that we farm for food and fibre. All of these animals are an intrinsic part of Australian society. And as an intrinsic part of our society, it's incumbent upon us to ensure we're treating them well. Australians, by and large, support egalitarian principles, the principle of a fair go. And many Australians, in fact, extend that principle to our treatment of animals. Recent research shows that Australians overwhelmingly oppose animal cruelty. They acknowledge that animals are sentient and support strong standards of animal welfare. A fair go for animals simply means treating them in a way that respects their sentience and protects their welfare. And this is where Australia can and should do better. Almost a decade of stagnation and lack of national leadership on animal welfare has seen Australia's animal welfare record begin to fall behind that of much of the rest of the developed world. But this can change. Australia has the potential to create a promising new era for animal welfare. With the recent change of the federal government and animal welfare legislative reviews progressing now right across the country, for the first time in a decade, Australia has a real opportunity to achieve much needed reform for animals. And that's why the Fair Go for Animals campaign is launching today. It's about building a fairer Australia for animals, one that truly respects their sentience and protects their welfare. I hope you'll join us in this important endeavour.
To explain why the Fair Go for Animals campaign has been created, I'd like to welcome my colleague, Meg Good. She's going to tell us all about the campaign and the significant problems that exist in the current policy framework for animal welfare in Australia. So I'll hand over to you now, Meg. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Peter, for that. So as Peter's explained, I'll just be briefly providing an overview of the Fair Go for Animals campaign. And you might be thinking, what is a fair go for animals? We're all very familiar with the term a fair go for all. It's a very well-known part of the Australian vernacular, and we all have different understandings of what a fair go means. But at its heart, a fair go means treating others with respect and with fairness. And when we say a fair go for all, we envisage the all as not only encompassing humans, but also encompassing animals. And so we think that a fair go for animals means treating animals in a way that respects their sentience and acknowledges the scientific fact that they are feeling, perceiving and emotional animals and protects their welfare. So research shows us that Australians overwhelmingly oppose animal cruelty, that they acknowledge this scientific fact that animals are sentient feeling beings, and they support strong standards of animal welfare. So if this is what a fair go for animals means and what we think should be happening for animals in Australia, the logical question to ask is this what animals are receiving in Australia? Are animals receiving a fair go? Unfortunately, and I'm sure many of you already know the answer is no. Animals in Australia are not receiving a fair go. The animal welfare governance system in Australia is broken. And there are many indicators of how the system is not functioning effectively. One of the first indicators is the fact that under Australian law, the sentience of animals is not recognised under animal welfare legislation, except in just one jurisdiction, the Australian Capital Territory. This is a very foundational, fundamental element of animal welfare legislation, to recognise that the very reason we have animal welfare acts that protect animals from pain and suffering is because they have the capacity to feel pain and suffering. And so the fact that we haven't been able to achieve this most fundamental reform across most of Australia is a real indicator of the fact that the system is not functioning effectively. Another really significant indicator is the fact that numerous practices that cause animals pain and suffering are perfectly legalised under the law in Australia. This is because we've passed various codes of practice, or what are now being termed animal welfare standards and guidelines, that codify standard industry practice, particularly in relation to farmed animals. So certain practices that you might not be able to do to a companion animal, a dog or a cat, because that would fall foul of animal welfare legislation, would constitute an animal cruelty offence, you can do to farmed animals perfectly legally. A classic example are routine husbandry practices such as mulesing, dehorning, castrating, etc. Taking parts of an animal off their bodies without the use of pain relief is perfectly legal. So the fact that that system is currently allowed is a really significant indicator of the fact that the system is broken. Another issue is the fact that enforcement responsibilities for animal welfare legislation are relegated to charities with limited government support. This is unprecedented. It's very unusual to have a public interest piece of legislation to be delegated to charitable organisations who then don't receive sufficient funding from government to perform their duties. It's not acceptable that they receive such little funding to perform these statutory obligations. And it really comes down to the fact, this fourth point, that governments view animal welfare as a very low priority issue compared to other comparable issues. And the fact that they view it as a low priority issue is evident in the rules that we have in regards to animal welfare standards, but also in relation to the fact that the scale of animal use is not reflected in the amount of funding that is provided for animal welfare services across Australia. And this system doesn't meet the expectations of the Australian community. The Australian community expects more from the system than this. And I think most Australians would be surprised to learn that legal protections for animals are completely inconsistent across the country. They are inconsistent between state and territory jurisdictions, and they're also inconsistent in terms of the type of animal. So how you're treated as an animal, the protections you receive under the law are really dependent on which jurisdiction you exist in Australia and what type of animal you have been classed as. And I think most Australians wouldn't view that as acceptable. They would want some sort of ethical or legislative consistency across the country. So you might be thinking, how have we gotten here? How has a country like Australia gotten to the point where we have an essentially broken animal welfare governance system? And at the heart of the regulatory problem is the fact that the very departments that are charged with promoting animal use industries are also the departments that are given responsibility for animal welfare. So agriculture departments in Australia have two interests. They need to promote animal welfare and they need to promote animal use industries. To some extent, these two interests do align. So promoting animal welfare to a certain extent can improve productivity and profitability, and such there isn't a conflict there. But there are instances where improving animal welfare to a certain extent can result in productivity and profitability losses for industry. And that's where the conflict comes in, where these two interests don't align perfectly. And these conflicts of interests are built into the system itself, because we actually assign in our institutional design of this governance system, we assign responsibility for animal welfare to agriculture departments and to ministers of agriculture. We don't separate these out into their own independent portfolio areas. So these conflicts of interest are not remediated in any way. And in fact, the system exacerbates them. And as a result of this systemic design and this flaw in the systemic design, animal use industries have an excessive degree of influence, both over animal welfare decision-making and the animal welfare standard setting process. And as a result of this, we've seen a real delay in progressing really important reforms for animals. And we'll discuss some of those examples a little bit later on. All of this is exacerbated by the fact and essentially allowed by the fact that we have a real lack of legislative guidance in Australia about what you can do in regards to how you run these animal welfare standard setting processes. There's also a lack of guidance about how you make decisions and what can go into these regulations that you create. So, for example, there is nothing that mandates that an independent scientific literature review is conducted before you create animal welfare standards, and nothing that determines how they should be considered in the process. There is nothing that says that you can't pass regulations which actually contradict the primary legislation under which they are made. So you can pass regulations such as codes of practice or standards and guidelines that actually contradict the protective aims of the animal welfare legislation itself. And that's because we don't have a proper legislative process, which is something we'll address a little later on. And finally, as I mentioned before, the chronic underfunding of animal welfare services across Australia exacerbates yet again all of these systemic flaws. So that's how we've gotten to this point. So you can see that it's very clear that the system is broken and we need reform. And the Alliance for Animals is putting forward a framework for reform, a path forward to a fairer Australia for animals, which my colleague will summarise in a moment. It's clear that the system is rigged against animals, that it deprioritises animals' interests and ensures that their interests often come out second best, that they're treated as second priority by government. Animal welfare science is not adequately considered throughout the process, and a lot of that is to do with the fact that there isn't a proper legislative process in place for how animal welfare standards are made. And this system ignores the views of the Australian public. This is not what the Australian public wants. We conducted polling earlier this year, nationally representative survey, that showed that 98% of Australians consider animal welfare to be important. 94% support laws that ensure animals are provided with a good quality of life. 97% support laws that ensure animals are protected from cruel treatment. So that's just a sample of some of the very supportive responses we received in regards to that survey that show what the Australian community expects from the animal welfare governance framework. As a result of the system that we currently have, we are lagging behind the rest of the world. Comparable nations have much further advanced animal welfare standards than Australia. And actually, we received a very embarrassing D grade ranking on World Animal Protection's Animal Protection Index. And that was largely because we lack national leadership in animal welfare. We don't have sufficient independence in our governance framework. And we haven't recognised the most basic elements of an adequate modern animal welfare framework, such as recognising the sentience of animals. Animals in Australia deserve better, and Australians deserve better. Australians expect better from this system, which is why we've put together the Fair Go for Animals campaign. And in particular, we've created a report that explains our solution to this problem, explains how we propose to fix this broken system. The Building a Fairer Australia for Animals report is a 76-page, fully referenced report outlining our framework for reform. So I'm going to hand over now to my colleague, Dr. Jed Goodfellow, who will outline what's in the report and our framework for reform. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Meg. That was a fantastic overview of the problem that we're facing in Australia when it comes to animal welfare governance. And as Meg's explained, the key resource we're launching today is the Building a Fairer Australia for Animals report. And that sets out the solutions to better animal welfare governance. So I'm going to hand over to Jed now to tell us more about what's in that report.
Great, thanks very much, Bitter, and thank you for Meg for that great context and background there. As you would have gleaned from that overview, the problems that we face with the animal welfare framework in Australia are very much systemic. They're very much at the foundation and built into the design of the system. So any systemic problem requires a systemic response, and that's very much where our reform framework is coming from. We're not looking at sort of tinkering around the edges of what is a fundamentally broken system. We're very much looking at redesigning the system itself to ensure that it's more robust, it's more independent, it's more democratic. And we're certainly very conscious of the fact that this reform framework is quite significant in nature. It's an ambitious reform framework, intentionally so, but we're in this for the long term. So we are confident that over time we will see elements of this reform framework starting to be reflected in state and federal approaches to animal welfare policy and standard setting, because they really do promote some pretty fundamental principles of our system of governance, including, as I mentioned, democratic principles, increasing transparency, increasing integrity and accountability in decision-making on animal welfare. So we've got 6 key reforms that I'll take you through now. Starting from the very top, we would like to see and do need to see ministerial recognition of animal welfare. As Meg outlined, currently animal welfare responsibilities are just delegated to agriculture portfolios, and that of course raises a lot of competing responsibilities for those ministers. And we find that even when agriculture ministers, individual ministers may have a strong personal view on animal welfare and may have good intentions going into the portfolio to achieve reforms for animal welfare, when they're in the portfolio, they very soon realise who their key stakeholder base is. And that, of course, is the agriculture stakeholders, and rightfully so. They're agriculture ministers. They're there to support and serve agricultural industries, including the animal-based industries within that broader sector. So when we see ag ministers, and as an example, here in WA, the outgoing agriculture minister, the Honourable Alana McTiernan, when ministers for agriculture make strong statements around animal welfare or may be critical of certain industry practices, they come under immense pressure from the agri-political lobby groups. As you can see here, one of the placards I thought summed up quite well this tension and this pressure that ag ministers face. If you can't read that, it says, Alana, you are the Minister for Agriculture. Start supporting WA farmers. You do not represent animal activists in WA. And that was in response to what I thought was a pretty modest statement around the issues in the live animal export trade. So we see here, there's a real sense of ownership over agriculture ministers by the agriculture constituency. And that's not surprising. That's because of the nature of that portfolio. And indeed, that's, the ag ministers are there for a reason to support and serve agriculture industries. The question is whether or not it's appropriate to then delegate animal welfare authority, animal welfare decision-making functions to those ministers under those sort of pressures. And we certainly think that because of those inherent restrictions, animal welfare responsibilities should be moved outside of agriculture ministries into separate ministerial portfolios. And we think that it's coming to the point where animal welfare is starting to be such a concern for the community that it should be elevated to the point where animal welfare is recognised in a ministerial title. So we're not expecting just a dedicated animal welfare minister. I mean, that would be ideal. Most likely it would be together with a range of other portfolio responsibilities. But so long as it was separate from agriculture and also mentioned in the title of the portfolio, we think that that would really elevate the level of importance of animal welfare within government. It would allow agriculture ministers to get on with their job of promoting agriculture while allowing a little bit more liberty for ministers of governments at the state and federal level to express stronger support for animal welfare measures and animal welfare reforms. So that's number one. The second major reform that is long overdue and needed in Australia is to establish a National Commission for Animal Welfare to undertake the role of leading the development of national animal welfare policy and standards in conjunction with the states and territories and of course, stakeholders. And I really emphasise that point, in conjunction with the states and territories, because this would not be a proposal to usurp the power of states and territories in relation to animal welfare. We're very conscious of the constitutional limitations in relation to who has authority and responsibility for animal welfare. In most cases, it resides with the states and territories, and we certainly acknowledge that. But that's not what is proposed with this model of an animal welfare commission. It would not be regulating, it would not be passing laws, it would not be enforcing laws. It would simply be bringing states and territories together to lead that development process for national strategy, policy and standards. And indeed, there's many examples of already existing Commonwealth agencies that perform precisely this function, where they're setting national standards on issues that are regulated by the states and territories in order to bring about national consistency, national coordination. Some examples include the National Transport Commission, Food Standards Australia and New Zealand. We've got the Safe Work Australia, the Australian Commission on Safety and Healthcare. There's some examples of federal bodies that are developing national policy and standards on issues regulated by the state. So it has been done before, and it certainly can be done in the animal welfare context as well. But don't take our word for it. This is not a proposal that we can really take credit for, because this was actually a key recommendation of the Australian Productivity Commission in their 2016 report on the regulation of Australian agriculture. After reviewing the current framework in Australia, identifying many of the deficiencies that we have outlined earlier today, the Commission recommended that an Australian Commission for Animal Welfare be established to perform that role of national standards development, to increase the independence of that function, its integrity, and taking a more robust science-based approach to setting those national standards. At the state and territory level, we're proposing that state animal welfare authorities would be established under state and territory animal welfare laws. So the current process is for departments of agriculture and primary industries to administer state and territory animal welfare laws. As Meg outlined, that gives rise to competing responsibilities and conflicts of interest. So in order to improve the integrity of that process, regulatory independence, establishing statutory animal welfare authorities under state legislation needs to be an important reform that we seek as well. The rationale for establishing state animal welfare authorities is precisely the same as the rationale for establishing independent environmental protection authorities, which all states and territories in Australia have, with the exception of Queensland. Although we note that the Queensland government is now considering the establishment of an environmental protection agency, and again, precisely because of the issues that we've raised earlier, but of course in the environmental context. As you can see there in their discussion paper from earlier this year, they note that a degree of structural separation can be beneficial as it provides protection from perceived or actual influence, and as a result can promote a culture of independence and increase confidence for stakeholders and the broader community. So going through this paper, you could replace the term environment with animal welfare, and it would make complete sense. That the rationale outlined here is precisely the rationale that we outline in the Building a Fairer Australia for Animals report for the establishment of state-based animal welfare authorities. So their functions would include the usual administrative functions under state and territory animal welfare acts, which could include overseeing the appointment of inspectors. The actual inspectors who enforce the legislation on the ground could still come from the range of bodies that they're currently appointed from, including departments of agriculture, police, RSPCA organisations, but they would be reporting to the state animal welfare authorities as opposed to the state departments of agriculture and primary industries. And this would really centralise enforcement efforts, centralise the administration of the legislation, and bring a much needed and stronger focus on animal welfare and regulatory integrity in those functions. So we think that's also a very important reform. So they're really the institutional reforms that are very necessary in order to address those competing responsibilities and conflicts of interest. In addition to that, we really need to see greater consistency taken to the application of our animal welfare laws and the decisions made under them. So in addition to the institutional reforms, we're calling for overarching decision-making principles to be introduced to state and territory animal welfare laws, so that decision makers, both within the relevant portfolio, being ministers that have responsibility for animal welfare, also department secretaries, would need to consider any impacts on animal welfare that their decisions may have, and also consider alternatives to those practices that may cause and decisions that may cause harm to animals. And importantly, these principles would not just apply within the animal welfare portfolio, but would apply across government. So any decisions made by government officers, authorities, commissions, etc., would need to consider and apply these decision-making principles. So that, of course, would be quite a significant reform, but it is a reform that is already on the agenda in Victoria. The Victorian government has proposed precisely this, and indeed, we've again borrowed this idea from the Victorian government, where they outlined this important reform in their plan for reviewing their state animal welfare legislation. They say in their discussion paper, or their plan, including an obligation for decision-making principles to be considered in the new laws would reinforce the commitment to animal welfare across the Victorian statute book. It would also recognise responsibilities for different portfolios across government. And that's, of course, extremely important, because animal welfare decisions that impact animals don't just occur, of course, in the agriculture portfolio. We've got many different areas of animal use and interaction, the racing industries, for instance, animals in zoos and aquaria. These are all areas that may be regulated under different portfolios. So having a consistent approach to decision-making, including considering these principles, would improve that consistency across government. They say that the decision-making principles aim to maximise positive outcomes for animals in their interactions with humans. The principles reinforce that animals have the capacity to feel, perceive their environment, and to have positive and negative experiences like pleasure and pain. So in other words, to recognise that they're sentient, to take that into account in making decisions that may impact animal welfare, and to consider alternatives and to mitigate and or avoid the likely harm caused. In addition to that, recognising the sentience of animals in the objects and purposes provisions of the state animal welfare laws would complement those decision-making principles. Of course, as Meg outlined, the sentience of animals is really the fundamental reason why their welfare matters. It's the reason why we have animal welfare laws. It's the reason why we're all here today discussing these issues, because we acknowledge, A, that animals are sentient, and B, that therefore means that their interests are ethically relevant, that we need to take them into account. So recognising animal sentience right up front and centre of the state animal welfare acts would aid the interpretation of the legislation and again promote that kind of consistent approach to decision making that we really need in Australia. And finally, fair and accountable standards development is also another key area for reform, because I would have to say, in terms of all of the failings of the current framework, this would have to be the biggest in terms of our lack of a national formal process to developing our country's animal welfare standards and codes. So these documents that are adopted under state and territory animal welfare laws are probably more important for animal welfare purposes than the actual animal welfare laws that they're adopted under, because they prescribe the conditions under which hundreds of millions of animals will be treated. So in terms of the numbers of animals involved, what's written in the national standards and guidelines or the model codes of practice is extremely important for animal welfare. Yet despite that, we don't have a formal process for developing these standards. We don't have any legislative requirements around either the process for developing those standards or indeed the outcomes that those standards need to meet. So this is a really significant omission within our current framework that needs to be addressed. At the moment, it's quite an ad hoc process. It relies on a particular state government putting their hand up to say, you know, we'll lead this process. And often that means it's the state government that has the largest proportion of the relevant industry that will put its hand up to lead a process, which of course then accentuates the risks and the potential for those conflicts of interest and for those industry actors and bodies to really capture the policy process. So it's very important that we have a more robust and accountable standards development process in Australia. Ideally, this process would be governed by and led by a National Animal Welfare Commission. But in the absence of that, or until that is implemented, there are a number of features that could be agreed between the states and territories and the federal government in a framework for setting national standards. And we would hope that that framework would include these key elements around independent governance and management, that it would include balanced and inclusive stakeholder representation, independent scientific literature review as a default step in that process for setting the standards, meaningful public engagement and consultation, and also published reasons for decisions. We don't really get that in Australia in relation to our animal welfare standards. We just get the final standards. In other countries like New Zealand, the National Animal Welfare Advisory Committee that's established under the New Zealand Animal Welfare Act will publish really detailed sets of reasons outlining their rationale for how they engaged in the inevitable sort of trade-off between different and competing priorities. So it's very transparent. Stakeholders and other groups can see how the decisions were made and what the rationale was. But really importantly, the process does need to be reflected and prescribed in the state and territory animal welfare acts as well, as I said, to increase the level of accountability for the process. So that's in relation to those key steps for the development of the standards, but also the outcomes that the standards need to meet. And in New Zealand, another great example there is that the Animal Welfare Act says very clearly that the standards and the regulations adopted under the Act can't be inconsistent with the duties of care and principles outlined in the Animal Welfare Act. So there's greater legislative coherence and consistency flowing through the framework, and that's certainly a major reform that Australia really needs to address at that state and territory level. And finally, it goes without saying that the final pillar of our reform framework is for greater funding and resourcing of animal welfare services in Australia, both relating to policy and standards development, but also enforcement as well. Unfortunately, the previous federal government really gutted animal welfare services in relation to standards and policy. They defunded the Australian Animal Welfare Strategy. It is positive to see that the current government did commit to renewing the Australian Animal Welfare Strategy with a funding base of $5 million over 4 years. But that's still quite a limited amount when you consider what needs to occur here. And of course, the reforms we're proposing will require further funding, but we're not talking about significant amounts of funding, certainly not relative to state and federal budgetary allocations. And much of the funding can be found and reallocated from existing sources within departments of agriculture and primary industries as well. But that's really all about government priorities again, and increasing levels of funding for animal welfare certainly would be commensurate with community expectations around the level of investment governments should be making in this really important area of public policy. So that is our reform framework. As I said earlier, it is an ambitious reform framework, but it's one that is based on solid policy foundation, and it's one that really does reflect and promote basic and fundamental principles of good governance around democratic principles, around improving integrity in decision-making, accountability, transparency, and creating a system that is more inclusive of the community's views around animal welfare. So we're confident that over time we will see these reform recommendations implemented, or at least elements of these reforms. And we certainly invite you to support us in that endeavour. So thank you very much. I'll hand back over to Bitter.
Thanks so much, Jed. That was excellent. And I can see we've already got some audience questions about the reforms that you've been talking about. If you haven't posted your question yet, please pop it into the Q&A. We'll come to those soon. But my first question in the discussion that I'll lead for the next few minutes is for Meg, because I'd like to invite Meg to tell us about how people and organisations can actually join the Fair Go for Animals campaign. So Meg, can you explain how they can do that?
Thank you, Bitter, and thanks, Jed, for that excellent explanation of what the campaign is, what the reforms are that we're seeking. So the Fair Go for Animals campaign, of course, launched just today, which is very exciting. We've already been endorsed by all of our incredible core member organisations, all of whom are on the Zoom with us today: Animals Australia, Compassion and World Farming, Four Paws Australia, Humane Society International Australia, Voiceless, and World Animal Protection. It's also been endorsed by various Alliance organisation network members. So these are leading animal protection organisations all across Australia who have already signed up to endorse the campaign. And if you are part of an organisation that's interested in endorsing what Jed just outlined, our 6-point framework for reform, then you can actually fill out a form on the website and you can choose to endorse the campaign as well. Individuals can also endorse the campaign via signing a pledge, which is at www.fairgoforanimals.org.au. And that may seem like a very small, insignificant thing to do, but it's actually one of the most significant things that you can do, because we can then take that to parliamentarians and in our meetings with decision makers and say to them, actually, X amount of Australians support this reform agenda. These important organisations support this reform agenda. And we can use it to show support for building a fairer Australia for animals. So that's all from me in terms of what you can do for the campaign, and of course encourage you to have a read of the report as well.
Thanks, Meg. Yes, of course, you'll be able to download the report from our website. It's live now. So let's talk a little bit about the reforms themselves. Jed, you talked particularly about the need for a National Animal Welfare Commission. and state animal welfare authorities. Could you explain how the functions of those two different bodies would differ?
Yes, so as I outlined, the commission would very much be about taking a leadership role in bringing states and territories, the jurisdictions, stakeholders together to formulate national policy, strategy, standards. It wouldn't be a regulatory body, so it wouldn't be enforcing the law. That would be the role of the state animal welfare authorities that would be established as statutory entities under state and territory animal welfare laws, in line with those constitutional arrangements where the states do have responsibility for animal welfare. Does that?
Oh, thanks, Jed. Yeah, and I think that's a really important distinction to make. In terms of the actual processes for animal welfare standards setting, Meg, you mentioned how those standards processes are not working. Could you maybe just give us an example of what you mean?
Yeah, unfortunately, there are many examples to draw from, but probably the most recent and topical example, and something that we included as a case study in our report, is what happened with the poultry standards review and the discussion about banning the use of battery cages. Battery cages have been banned in numerous other jurisdictions around the world, recognising that the welfare needs of hens simply can't be met within these systems. That's what the science tells us. They can't engage in all of their range of natural behaviours within these systems. So that's why multiple jurisdictions have moved to ban them and have moved to other housing systems, including housing systems that aren't that far removed from the battery cage system. It's not a radical reform by any means. However, in Australia, the debate about removing battery cages has just been completely dysfunctional. So back in 2015, we had the poultry code review process commence. We're now in 2022, and we still don't have agreement from all of the states and territories about exactly when we'll get this ban on battery cages. So in that time, in that 7-year period, I think 700 million animals is what we've estimated. 700 million layer hens have been stuck inside these inadequate battery cages because we haven't had a sufficiently efficient animal welfare standard setting process to enable them to be transitioned out of these cages. We're now looking at a 2032 to 2036 ban range. But again, as I said, this hasn't been fully agreed by the different agriculture ministers across the country. So it just shows you how dysfunctional this system can be. And there were lots of issues with the process itself in regards to how the poultry code was reviewed. I'm not going to go into all of the detail because the report does cover this in detail, and I encourage you to read that section. But essentially, animal welfare stakeholders really felt that their involvement in the process was being stage managed, and that the egg industry had an inordinate amount of influence in regards to its relationship with government. And Freedom of Information documents revealed that certainly was the case, and that it was very much focused on the egg industry's position of not wanting to have a ban on battery cages, and that the government was seemingly aligning with that position. So as I said, I won't go into all of the details, but something really significant that came out of that was that animal welfare scientists at the time felt that the science was not being adequately taken into consideration. In fact, one state conducted its own independent scientific literature review because it was so concerned about the way that science was being considered in this process. Because at the end of the day, the science is pretty unequivocal that these cages are not sufficient and that they should be banned, and that we should have alternative housing systems. So as I say, read the report for the full detail, but that's just one example of how the standard setting process is failing animals and failing Australians.
Yes, thanks, Meg. I mean, obviously, it's really concerning that, you know, that one process is still 7 years on and hasn't actually resulted in new standards being implemented. Jed, I've got one question for you before we move to the audience questions. I'm aware that some departments of agriculture have taken steps to separate out animal welfare from industry promotion in the structure of their departments. Do you think that helps the regulatory capture issue, or is it enough to address the issue? Or I mean, why do we need entirely new statutory bodies to address this?
Yeah, that's correct. In more recent times, which I guess is a positive development because it shows that the departments are perhaps becoming a little more conscious of these competing responsibilities. We have seen internally within the Department of Ag bureaucracies a slight internal separation between animal welfare policy functions and industry promotion functions. That is better than not having that degree of internal separation, but the problem there is that it doesn't overcome those fundamental competing responsibilities, because the animal welfare units within Departments of Agriculture are still part of the broader chain of command there. And on major policy decisions or major regulatory decisions, they will inevitably go up the chain of hierarchy. So you will still have the Secretary of the departments and indeed the Ministers for Agriculture, who will, of course, be setting the policy settings for those animal welfare branches to effectively follow. And we've seen pretty clear examples of the animal welfare branches or those who have responsibility for animal welfare being overridden by officers higher up the chain, or indeed by agriculture ministers as well. Both in two examples spring to mind, one in terms of live animal exports, where there was an exemption for an export vessel to export sheep to the Middle East during the prohibited northern summer period. The initial officer reviewing that exemption application denied the exemption application on animal welfare grounds. It was going to present too great a risk. That was then elevated up the chain. The exporter put in a new exemption application, and a more senior officer accepted that exemption application, and the shipment was able to go to the Middle East. But it just showed the way when the matters go up the chain of hierarchy, where officers that are more senior or the ministers who are very conscious of the broader objectives of the department in terms of industry promotion, those factors come into play again. I won't go into the other example, just out of time to go to other questions.
No, that's great, Jed. Thank you. So look, we're going to go to audience questions now. I'm just going to tell people in the audience, we've had a few questions about sort of which political parties are supportive of these reforms, and rather than sort of go into detail about that right now, I'd suggest that you go to the Alliance for Animals website and just look at the federal election campaign pages and the Victorian election campaign pages. Those can show you some examples of where different parties sit on the major reforms that we're talking about. So Meg, the first audience question is for you. You mentioned the discrepancy between ACT and the other states and territories about recognition of sentience. How does that translate into improved animal welfare practices or outcomes? And has it resulted in any change?
Yes, that's the big question with sentience recognition. Essentially, our position is that this isn't a radical reform. It's not about directly impacting on animal welfare outcomes as a result of this reform. It's about actually recognising something that is already at the basis of animal welfare legislation and just needs to be made explicit. We do think there are benefits associated with sentience recognition, but it's not the panacea for solving all of the problems with animal protection, unfortunately. One of the benefits that we think it holds is the fact that it actually provides a science-based standard for protection, because at the moment we have quite inconsistent approaches taken to why we protect some animals in some ways and why we don't, whereas this provides a scientific basis to how we protect animals, and we think that's preferable. It also improves legislative consistency, and as we view this as a foundational reform, we view it as something that all animal welfare legislation should just be implementing, but because it makes sense and it's at the core of the legislation. But we also see it working in conjunction with various other reforms that we have proposed. So, for example, in the report, we outline the fact that the combination of recognising sentience with what Jed was talking about, the proposed decision-making principles, would help to build a more coherent legislative structure. And under that structure, it'd be much harder to justify prescribing regulations like codes of practice that contradict the duties and offences outlined under the Animal Welfare Acts. That issue I was referring to in my presentation about the fact that you're perfectly able to do that at the moment because we have no adequate legislative process outlined. So I hope that addresses the question.
Yeah, thanks. But we've got a related question about Queensland's missed opportunity to recognise sentience in their revised Animal Protection Act, and I guess that also begs the question about the review in Victoria at the moment, and the review that has commenced but hasn't finished yet in Western Australia. Where are we up to in other states?
Yeah, so Victoria has committed to recognising animal sentience in its revised Animal Welfare Act, so that's really positive to see. The WA government has accepted a recommendation of their independent review into their act, which effectively describes and outlines what animal sentience is. It just doesn't use the S word. So interesting to see, what can pass through, and because there is a little bit of, debate around what recognising animal sentience will actually mean. And the Victorian government, in that plan that I showed earlier, did a fantastic job of actually outlining what recognising sentience does do and what it doesn't do. So it doesn't change the legal status of animals. They're still property under the law. It doesn't change that legal status. But as we outlined, it will provide guidance to decision makers under the legislation about the fundamental basis for why animal welfare is important. That will hopefully inform their interpretation of the legislation. So yes, it's still right now only the ACT, which has recognised animal sentience, but I think we will see further Australian jurisdictions coming on board with that pretty soon.
Thanks, Jed. That's great to know. Look, the next question is quite a general one. I'll ask you, Jed. Are there particular countries in the world that we can look at as leaders in this space and learn from?
Yes, certainly. And I think we borrow from different elements of different countries. But in terms of standard setting, I think the New Zealand framework is a really strong one. And I know I know there's New Zealanders on the line as well who may disagree or may not have as optimistic a view as myself, but it's all relative, I guess. Relative to Australia's approach, it is a quite a robust approach that the New Zealanders take, and that's because the process is outlined in their National Animal Welfare Act. Yes, we don't have a National Animal Welfare Act, but these principles and these procedures can be introduced into state and territory animal welfare acts that are the acts that adopt the standards and the codes. So I would point to New Zealand, certainly, for standard setting. I mean, the Europeans also do this really well. The European Union has their panel on animal health and welfare, an independent panel that provides the scientific basis for the development of their animal welfare policy and standards as well. And the transparency around that process is really strong. So I think both the European Union and New Zealand do things a lot better than Australia currently does, which is unfortunate because Australia has the capacity. It could be a world leader in this area. We have a great research and university sector. We have large animal-based industries. We have a general population, a public that is sympathetic to and supportive of animal welfare issues and concerns. So there's no reason why Australia couldn't be an international leader in this space as well.
Thanks, Jed. We've got time for a few more questions. The next one is really about empowering people. So how will these reforms empower and support individuals to speak up about animal welfare issues and report cruelty? At the moment, powerful systems are stacked against individuals who try to speak out. Would either of you like to answer that one?
Yeah, I can have a crack at it. So there's probably two ways in which it empowers people, and I think it's simply by virtue of having a more independent and impartial governance system for animal welfare. So where people can express their views in a political sense. So if they want to see things change and they want to see reform, they can make their views known to, for instance, a National Animal Welfare Commission, where that commission may take their views on board more than the current arrangements with departments of agriculture undertaking these functions, give it greater weight, I guess. So that's one area where community expectations could be given, stronger consideration and regard. In relation to reporting animal cruelty matters, so in an enforcement context, I think having state-based animal welfare authorities with that added focus and dedication to animal welfare may very well assist in terms of public reporting and responses to reports of animal cruelty as well. There are different enforcement arrangements across the country, but in many cases, the departments of agriculture will take responsibility for animal welfare reports that are outside of metropolitan area or relating to what's referred to as commercial livestock. And the responses to those reports may not be as sufficient as what the responses may be if it was a dedicated state-based animal welfare authority. So I'm not sure if that answers the question, but I think having a more inclusive democratic framework for animal welfare will empower Australians to exercise their views on animal welfare.
Yeah. No, that's great. Now, look, we do have more questions lined up there, but I think we're going to start to wrap up now. For those people that have put in questions, feel free, that haven't been answered, feel free to email them to us if you would like us to follow up on those. If we know who you are, we'll attempt to answer them after the webinar. But I'd like to just throw to Jed to wrap up and provide some last words about the campaign. And so I'll flick over to you, Jed.
Right. Well, I want to say thank you to everyone for coming along today. I know there's a lot of government policy people, advisors, and politicians as well on the line. So it's really fantastic to see this level of engagement and interest. So thank you very much for coming along to listen to the reforms that we're proposing, and we really look forward to working with both you and the general community in terms of implementing these reforms over time, because it's long overdue, and we can do a lot better.
And thank you everybody for joining us, for listening to Meg and Jed. Thank you, Meg and Jed, for fantastic presentations. And please go to our website. Thanks, Meg. Go to the website, have a download the report, and if you're interested in pledging your support, that is really straightforward to do from that page. If you're an organization, you can also register your interest in endorsing the campaign through that website as well. So thank you everybody for your time, and goodbye.